Friedrich Nietzsche, Chapter 2. As suggested earlier, Nietzsche's thoughts do not come to us in neat packages of systematic thinking. We are close to a fire when we listen to him, sensing both the consuming heat and the blinding light of his spirit. Like Kierkegaard, he demands of us passion and exaltation, and he will be understood only when we surrender to the magic fireworks of his extremes and contradictions. He creates a mood rather than a rational conviction, and it is no surprise that he has been favorably quoted by believers as well as atheists, by conservatives as well as rebels. For almost every one of his truths there can be found another truth contradicting the first. The subtitle of Thus Spoke Zarathustra indicates this inherent contradiction. It is, quote, a book for everybody and nobody, close quote. Much of his thinking is a monologue, a persistent contradiction within himself, which ends at last in the exclusive self-reflections of Ecce Homo, written shortly before the outbreak of his insanity. Quote, I have been more of a battlefield than a man, close quote, he said. His thinking is one great protest against the logical construction of a philosophical system, an explosive trend that had begun with Kierkegaard's rebellion against a, quote, system about being which cannot possibly exist, close quote. He has his own tragic share of the tensions between reason and instinct, emotion and logic, tradition and irreverence, so characteristic of his time, that were to foreshadow the breakdown of Europe's civilization. He wants to be an artist, a prophet or saint, and a teacher, but he is again and again fascinated by exalted visions and images that defy systematic presentation. His thinking is the product of emotional sensation, which gives his entire work a chaotic as well as an artistic note. Any noble thought rising in him is immediately attacked by rebellious, brilliant, or cynical counter-arguments and suspicions. He knows he can never find his true self. It must remain elusive, tragically hidden. But instead of regretting this condition, he praises errors as a base element of life, to be accepted heroically. Everybody and everything must grow in opposition to resistance, contradiction, darkness, and death. Nietzsche consciously employed the methods of indirect communication, which had also been Kierkegaard's enigmatic tool. Instead of speaking himself, he makes Zarathustra speak, or the quote-unquote free spirit, and many of Nietzsche's extreme statements are meant to produce agreement as well as opposition, or the divining of a half-truth. They initiate chain reactions of intuitive perspectives. The pseudo-scriptural language in which Zarathustra is written sets the mood for a receptive reverence, only to be shattered at the will of the prophet. Much of it is an appeal, a question, an ambiguity, or a seeming play on words. As in the case of Kierkegaard, truth is for Nietzsche too profound, elusive, and vast to be caught in bare words. It is of the essence of life itself, and silence, the mask of gaiety and light-mindedness, the ironic wisdom of the jester and buffoon, or man's double, are necessary for conveying some of the dialectical character of truth. His judgments are more than appraisals of that which is. Their volatile and propelling force has the power of transcendence. When he seems to deal with the past or present, the invisible hand of the magical language, of his magical language, removes barriers to the future, and new perspectives suddenly open up. Kierkegaard's key word is quote-unquote spirit. Nietzsche's emphasis was on life, power, and instinct, all threatened by intellect and spirit, perverted by a misfit culture, and to be defended by an undefinable vitalism. In spite of the tragic seriousness of his life and his later influence upon politics, there has always been something quixotic about Nietzsche's claim that he was a reformer or revolutionist. and it is interesting to read of his intense interest in the figure of Don Quixote de la Mancha. Like him, Nietzsche lived most of his life in a void. His friendships were few and short-lived. His career as a university teacher was all too brief. He was a master artist in the realm of theory, meditation, and dream, but not a man of action, neither in life nor death, fitted for the tragic role in Europe's disintegration, which he was destined to play after his death. As in all existentialist thinking, his true realm was the future, the potential, and his perspective medium was a sensitive intuition. That which existed or appeared as the fleeting essence of life was unsupported, fragile, and fraught with peril. He spoke of himself as the, quote, philosopher of the hazardous, perhaps, close quote. Life's motion forward and upward was to him the beautiful urge worthy of the artist's senses. Much as his brilliant intellectual universalism impresses us, his passion remained within Kierkegaard's quote-unquote first stage of aesthetic. That is rather significant that his friends and foes agree only on his poetry's undisputed perfection. His attacks upon morality and the middle class move him close to Oscar Wilde's degenerative asceticism, although Nietzsche's image of the coming man appeared austere and heroic. His borderless prophecies were no substitute for the morality he set out to destroy in his fury of creating chaos. His frontier thinking lacked the essence of concrete guidance towards a realizable goal. The lonely philosopher's desire to reimagine a single one as part of his self-chosen destiny, and he could promise nothing but a solitary and mysterious nobility to a man when he should succeed in becoming what he was meant to be. Like Kierkegaard and Tolstoy, Nietzsche neither expects nor wants to find disciples. He wants new quote-unquote single ones at a time when the average mass man no longer counts. His own unhappy experiences undoubtedly colored his views on man. There is a mixture of pity, love, and condescension in his image of man. Man is a cruel, courageous, and vain animal. He is, quote, God's monkey, close quote, whom God in his long eternities created for a pastime. But man is also aware of values of which no animal knows anything. Yet man, the blonde beast, cannot trust himself. He takes out his resentment on others when plagued by dissatisfaction with himself. He is vain, oversensitive, resentful, proud, and of course dishonest with himself. Everything in human conduct can be reduced to the will for self-assertion. Much of Freud and Adler's later thinking had been anticipated by Nietzsche in an intuitive manner that makes these psychologists everlastingly indebted to him. The truly valuable beings are artists, philosophers, and perhaps also the saints. But Superman is destined to fulfill our highest dreams. Nietzsche's vision was that of the new man, the one who would not only will reproduce himself, but build himself up to a being beyond the, quote, too much, too many, close quote, of the mob. He will be a higher, but of course also a lonely man. The time is drawing to a close when it was enough to be merely a contemporary, one of the crowd. The future man is needed, the Superman, whom society will not yet recognize and to whom it will attach the stigma of loneliness. His secret nobility will be of an aristocratic elevation, for which no pattern exists. He has nobody to follow, and nobody should be asked to follow him. If he should ever step before the public with a claim of superiority, he will soon become dishonest, attempt a selfish rule, and like Napoleon, degenerate into a despicable and dangerous beast. Nietzsche's judgment about his fellow men are, however, something other than venomous insults. At the bottom of his heart, he loves man, but he wants him to become better, higher, nobler than he cares to be himself. Man's dishonesty with himself is his greatest enemy. When he makes a mistake, his memory admits, quote, I have done this, close quote, but his pride opposes by saying, quote, I cannot have done this, close quote, and pride wins out over memory. Man, according to Nietzsche, is full of contradiction, loves life, creative work, splendor, success, and of course, he loves himself. But he also cherishes a secret love for the nothing, for annihilation and destruction. Much of this image is naturally a reflection of Nietzsche's thinking about himself. He suffers so much from the split in his whole being that he speaks of himself at one and the same time as of a beginning and an end. He is a beginning, meaning an entirely new type of man who belongs to a different astronomical order of the spirit and whose message will be a landmark in history. He, quote unquote, breaks mankind's history into two pieces, close quote. But he considers himself also decadent, the first European nihilist who denies all existing values. He is at once destroyer and builder. And in this regard, his gospel is of one piece. It is therefore only logical when he asks us not to read his books, quote, like looting soldiers, close quote, choosing appealing passages at random from his aphorisms, which he was the first to employ extensively in German literature. Instead, we are to read ourselves into a quote-unquote passionate mood in order to perceive the short rays of light that will lead us onward and upward. He is fully aware that his teachings are meant only for the few, yet he feels the duty to speak out publicly in the marketplace because he hopes inaudible echoes will arise in the few who may feel the appeal. Thus, Nietzsche's work aims at being an appeal, a new gospel, but not a system of philosophy. Nietzsche's Zarathustra is probably the most far-reaching influence in Europe. It was said that the two books which thousands of German soldiers carried during the First War were the New Testament and Zarathustra. Subsequent events in the rise of Hitlerism and its emphasis on racial superiority have shown many traces of Zarathustra's influence. Yet, it would be incorrect to call this book his chief work. There is no magnum opus of Nietzsche. All his books are the volcanic testimony of a genius whose burning passion to see the new man rising was unable to channel his lightning-like thoughts into the calm language of reason or the methodical persuasion of the teacher. He was a prophet, chosen and doomed, knowing, like Kierkegaard, that only a few quote-unquote single ones might be kindled by his spark, yet having to address the same wide audience whom he thought to have had to condemn. And again, like Kierkegaard, he was surrounded by mediocrity, exposed to the censorship of misunderstanding and ill will, and forced to finance many of his publications now treasured as part of world literature. Nietzsche's pessimistic image of man as a slave to himself and others by implication and in open combat attacks man's moral principles. The new quote-unquote Superman, Uberman, a term taken from Goethe's Faust, is law unto himself. He is autonomous and will impose his wishes upon the, quote, much too many, close quote. Those of whom Melville's Ahab in Moby Dick had spoken over 30 years earlier, 1851, as, quote, a mob of unnecessary duplicates, close quote. The clever device of these, quote-unquote, superfluous ones is the subject of the great and free man to their own, quote-unquote, slave morality by adopting Jesus' teachings of humility, meekness, and suffering. They follow a, quote, pale, anemic, quote, Christian ideal by which they judge everyone. A Christian's thinking is perverted. Even when he humbles himself, he does so only to be exalted. Parentheses, in contradiction to Luke 28:14, close parentheses. His great delight is the mean and petty pleasure of condemning others. Society, considering itself moral and good in the conventional Christian sense, hates the higher type of man and considers his isolation the result of guilt and the well-deserved stigma of social unfitness. The morality it wants is nothing more than to reduce everyone to its own level. Man, as a Christian, occupies proudly the judgment seat. But Jesus, for whom Nietzsche always preserved a high regard, was not a judge. Nietzsche emphasizes the fact that Jesus opposed those who judge others and wanted to destroy the morality existing in his age. Christ's rebellion attacked the Jewish hierarchy, the quote-unquote just and supreme rulers, and Nietzsche calls him an anarchist who had to die for this sin, not for the sins of others. Jesus abolished the idea of guilt and sin. How could he have died for the sins of others? God, like life itself, is beyond and above good and evil. Christ's morality was fit to be lived only by Christ himself, a thought akin to that of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, who also reserves Christ's morality to a few thousand supermen. Jesus remains the only Christian who ever lived, but he was crucified by man. The Christians are making of their professed faith a weird comedy. Jewish Christian morality is, quote, the instinct of the herd against the strong and independent ones, close quote, an instinct also against the happy ones who are creators of their own law. Christian morality is a child of resentment and confesses its own inability to know what is good or bad. It teaches that God alone has this knowledge, but God has died.